Hello, and welcome to the New York State Archives webinar module series on record scheduling, a family of short presentations providing overviews of topics related to retention and disposition of government records. This module's topic is appraising historical records of state agencies. My name is Dennis Riley, and I will be your presenter. In this module, we'll introduce the idea of appraisal and the concepts behind archival or historical value. We'll explore the criteria the State Archives uses when assessing the enduring value of state government records, and then we'll outline the process the State Archives uses to determine archival value and the role state government entities play in ensuring the essential evidence of their activities become part of the historical record. Appraisal, at its most basic, is an assessment or analysis of the evidential and informational value of material to identify records that should be permanently preserved in the state archives. It should be emphasized that in this context, we are concerned with archival or historical value, not monetary value. Archival appraisal seeks to be an objective process insofar as we resist personal bias. As such, we seek or need to ask certain questions about the content and context of records that might affect their enduring value, essentially the who, what, why, and where regarding the materials in question. Our analysis weighs answers to these questions, and we prioritize which records have the most research value and represent the essential evidence of a particular function, event, or community. We ought to make an informed decision based on our answers, instead of making a seemingly capricious decision or relying on gut feeling or instinct. Identification of archival records can happen throughout the record's life cycle, though often the earlier we can do so, the better. And this is especially true when we consider electronic records. If we have identified historical records throughout the life cycle, we can ensure such materials will be in good shape at the point of transfer to the archives. The goal of appraisal within the New York State context is to preserve records that document the major activities and functions of state government and its impact on communities across New York. So let's dig a little deeper into the concept of archival value. The first notion I'd like to introduce is primary and secondary value. This is not to be confused with primary source or secondary source. Records typically are considered to have two use values. This is especially true in the U.S. archival context. Primary value represents the value for which the record was created in the first place. For example, the record was created for a specific reason, which may be fiscal, legal, or administrative. Understanding the primary value of records is important if our appraisal is meant to document government processes and programs. Understanding the context of creation will help inform the historical value of the materials. As a rule, government entities do not create records for their historical value. Rather, determining this is part of conducting appraisal. Some records will have historical importance beyond that for which they were created, and this is secondary value. This value does not imply that it is any less. It simply means a value other than that for which the record was originally created. For example, with wills, they are created for legal reasons in order to settle an estate. But their initial importance ends when the estate is actually settled. Secondary value includes information about life in the past, maybe the social status of an individual, or monetary value of items at a certain period in time if there is an inventory of property attached to the will. Within the context of New York State, records have unique and enduring value as evidence and information about the operation of government and its impact on the people of New York, as well as the people and the events which shaped New York history. Keep in mind that informational and evidential value are not mutually exclusive. The State Archives has authority to appraise and acquire the official records of state government when they have sufficient historical value to justify their permanent preservation. This is referred to in several statutes, but most notably in Arts and Cultural Affairs Law, Section 57.5. And the Archives has developed specific appraisal criteria and a standard procedure we follow in order to determine when state agency materials meet this threshold. So why exactly is archival appraisal important? Why is identifying and preserving historical records important? The materials entrusted to state archive stewardship document the critical functions of government, protect the public's rights, enhance civic engagement, improve cultural knowledge and understanding, and ensure transparency and accountability of government. We are entrusted to ensure the preservation of and access to records of state government, to ensure the authenticity and integrity of those records, and to preserve and make accessible a credible and reasonably complete historical account of state government and the diverse communities it serves. To help guide our appraisal activity, we have broken down the criteria on which we base archival value of state government records into several categories. These include the primary legal, administrative, and environmental value, which provide information and evidence of state government functions. And they also include secondary cultural and intrinsic value of the records. We'll look at these in a bit more detail. Here's a list of the types of documentation that provide primary legal value, generally records that provide evidence of legal rights and responsibilities. These include efforts to enact laws, the documentation of legal intent and precedents, the election or appointment of public officials, the status of private and public corporations, land ownership and the transfer of rights related to land, the legal status of individuals, including marriage and death, and the state's financial obligations or claims. Similarly, primary administrative value can be found in documentation that records the establishment or reorganization of agencies as state government evolves, their management functions, such as issue analysis or policy and decision making, the development of regulations and laws by agencies, efforts to audit or investigate government operations, records that provide evidence of the civil service or labor management relations, or those records that describe or provide evidence of the development of the state budget and the appropriations of funds, and finally, any documentation of activities that seek to communicate government programs and activities to the public. Finally, we have established the importance of primary environmental value for records which document state involvement in issues affecting wildlife and habitat, climate and energy, geology, land use, pollution, and public works projects. Essentially, the natural environment and the human impact on the environment. We have also laid out secondary value to encompass both cultural value and intrinsic value. Materials with cultural value document the people and population groups, organizations, and activities such as social or economic activity that are affected by state government. For example, population groups might include prisoners or handicapped persons or military personnel. Organizations include educational institutions, insurance companies, or even political parties. Social and economic activities might include criminal arrests and prosecutions, public health crises, or traffic and transportation issues. Intrinsic value is a slightly different notion of value in that it stems from the physical form of the materials. On occasion, the physical form of records or a particular document may have value or be subject to an area of study. This may include physical features such as seals or watermarks, artistic or aesthetic value of drawings or sketches, perhaps educational or exhibit value of specific materials, or public interest because of a direct association with a significant person, event, or issue. For example, we might consider the state copy of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It's not the official copy, but because of its historical associations and its age and its physical characteristics, it still has immense historical value. A word of caution, just because something is old or historically neat is not always sufficient to conclude it has intrinsic value. This justification is used sparingly, if at all. Few government records will rise to the level of intrinsic value. In fact, few archival materials are retained solely on this basis. Sources of archival records from state agencies often include the following: executive and policy-making offices, legal departments, advisory or specially appointed bodies, rule-making entities, any inter- or intra-agency unit and those involved in research or planning activities, public relations offices, and adjudicative bodies. Program-level materials that are often deemed archival are varied, but can include documentation of the essential mission on significant activities and accomplishments of state agencies, summary records of the development of the state budget and expenditures or the service of state officials and employees, the state's acquisition and disposition of real property, including grants of unappropriated land. There are major public works projects such as the Thruway system or the Erie and Barge Canal system. Records that document the formation and dissolution of corporations, both public and private, that are regulated or overseen by the state, such as school districts or banks and insurance companies. Individuals who have contact with state institutions or are involved in state functions or services, such as military service, incarceration, mental health treatment, or even human rights issues. Then there are major disasters in New York history that generally generate historical materials. We can think of Tropical Storm Agnes in 1972, or the attacks on the World Trade Center in 2001. And finally, there are what we consider underdocumented aspects of New York's history, such as racial or ethnic population groups, science and technology, or even higher education. As I've touched on a few times now, the purpose of the State Archives appraisal process is to assess government functions and the content and context of the resulting agency records. At the end of the process, we try to make an informed, defensible decision as to the enduring value of materials to serve as the essential evidence of government activity and its impact on communities across New York State, as well as preserving documentation of special significance, whether that is historical, scientific, or other research value. The mechanics of conducting an appraisal follow the procedures outlined in the State Archives Appraisal Manual. The steps taken generally include an appraisal archivist who will work with agency staff to identify and assess historical value of records. Usually this is initiated as part of a record scheduling activity and as part of the initial review of an agency request for disposition items. State Archives staff will assess whether the records in question require appraisal. This determination is based on the source of the records, the informational content of the records, the context of the records and their relationship to other documentation, the actual or potential uses of the records, particularly their research use, and their general condition, volume, or other physical characteristics. In order to fully understand the materials, the appraisal archivist will discuss the appraisal with the agency records management officer and interview relevant agency staff to fully understand the nature of the records, their creation and use, as well as the functions of the program unit creating them. This includes understanding any accessibility issues, such as whether records contain information that needs to be restricted. The appraiser will survey the records to determine their general contents and subject matters, their existing arrangement, access, and use, to identify any gaps or duplication, and to observe their physical condition. And finally, to determine whether any summary records or indexes might exist. The appraiser will also conduct additional research as necessary to understand the context of the records and the function of the agency program unit in relationship to New York State government as a whole, as well as local and federal government programs and activities, and maybe even non-government entities. This allows the appraiser to place the records within the social, political, cultural, and economic context of New York State history. This will also help us to understand how the records relate to materials already held by the State Archives, as well as materials that might be held in other locations or other repositories. This may include consulting experts outside state government who have specialized knowledge in the field or topics related to the records being appraised. The appraiser then prepares a report which lays out their assessment and recommendations as to whether or not the materials in question should be scheduled for eventual transfer to the State Archives. A quick word about born digital or electronic records. When it comes to appraisal, we adopt a media-neutral approach to born digital records. In other words, bits and bytes are no different than paper. The format or media of a set of records is not generally part of our appraisal criteria. However, electronic records or special format records require more proactive intervention, ideally closer to the point of creation. In this regard, it is useful to embed appraisal when designing any system or workflow, and to develop a more proactive and frequent transfer process for any materials that might be deemed archival. When appraising electronic records, we need to be aware of a variety of elements, including the technical environment, which includes hardware and software and the operating system, the structure and arrangement of files, and any relevant database elements. Authenticity relates to authorship and the dates of creation or modification, ownership and responsibility over files, and data accuracy and its completeness. There may be access restrictions such as encryption or passwords, and then there are the sometimes challenging issues related to digital preservation, such as proprietary file formats. And duplication is a particularly thorny issue when it comes to electronic records because multiple copies can be kept in multiple places and multiple backup systems. And on occasion, there will be physical media considerations if we're dealing with floppy disks or CD-ROMs or other potentially obsolete storage media. Generally speaking, when dealing with special format materials such as electronic records, we will want to undertake a separate technical appraisal to better understand the nature of the records and our ability to preserve and provide access to them. State agencies are a critical partner in the appraisal process. State agencies are positioned to best understand their principal functions, activities, and the resulting documentation, and thus help guide State Archives' efforts in ensuring the historical record is identified, preserved, and accessible to future users. This includes working with the State Archives to improve records management processes and business workflows in order to safeguard the state's information assets, while at the same time alerting us to records with potential historical value. We need state agencies to be active collaborators in the appraisal process, to educate us about the content, context, business needs, and use of agency records. This is especially true when it comes to information systems or database development. This allows us to reach sustainable and defensible conclusions as to the relative historical value of agency records. Of course, being proactive in transferring records when eligible to State Archives custody is the ultimate end goal of appraisal. This relieves state agencies from the burden of managing their historical records and allows the state to leverage the expertise and resources of the State Archives in accomplishing this important outcome. Once we have worked with the agency to properly identify and understand the primary value of the records, as well as consulted outside experts and sources to place the records in the larger documentary landscape, and fully assess their potential secondary value, The appraisal report is considered by a team of managers who represent the State Archives program units. In essence, once we have asked all the questions, we review the answers and the information about the records. We don't make our decision based solely on one aspect of the materials, but rather we assess all the factors in order to present a set of solid recommendations. This may include determining the records are archival, in which case we will discuss with the agency what an appropriate retention period would be in order to satisfy agency needs. If the records are no longer needed for agency business, we may recommend and arrange for their immediate transfer to State Archives custody. We may determine that the records are non-archival, in which case we will also work with the agency to determine an appropriate retention period. Or on occasion, we may determine a sampling approach is appropriate, which is a method of reducing bulk, homogeneous sets of records to achieve a representation of the whole. And this is a practice we follow when dealing with inmate case files, for example, because of the sheer volume would simply overwhelm the State Archives capacity. We have worked with to develop a sampling approach where a set of records substitutes and acts as a representation of the fuller set of records. But the appraisal team evaluates questions and probes the appraisal report's conclusions. This may result in seeking clarification or revision, or the appraisal team may concur with the report's conclusions and recommend that they be accepted. The state archivist has final authority for approving an appraisal's recommendations as agreed by the appraisal team. So it is not one person making this decision, but it is an outcome of a consideration of multiple viewpoints and experiences and perspectives. We then document the decision, including the reasoning on which the decision is based. This is primarily reflected in the appraisal report itself and often becomes the basis of retention and disposition items. For example, in the state agency general schedule, there are approximately 8 or 9 series that have been appraised for eventual transfer to the archives. These include minutes and meeting files of governing and advisory bodies, annual reports, public relations materials such as press releases, and agency budget requests. Agency-specific retention items, also referred to as RDAs, may also result from an appraisal process where we have determined materials should eventually be transferred to State Archives custody once the operational needs of the agency for the records have been satisfied. Documenting our appraisal decision is important so that we don't have to appraise the same records over and over again, though reappraisal sometimes does occur. Perhaps more importantly, it allows the State Archives to be transparent in how we execute our responsibility to the historical record, as well as the memory and understanding of our collective experience. It also serves as important evidence to future researchers and others as to why certain records exist and why others might not exist. Some final thoughts. The State Archives cannot keep all state agency records. Keeping everything is not possible or practical. Keeping more stuff does not equal keeping the essential knowledge of government programs or activities. Appraisal is not easy, and it shouldn't be. It represents the hard decisions as to what will be reflected in the historical record and represents significant power in the formation of our understanding and our memory of our collective experience. Our analysis should clearly demonstrate why materials provide the essential evidence of significant functions and their effect on communities across New York State. Records just shouldn't be good, they need to be good for something, some purpose. Otherwise, we are committing scarce and finite resources in terms of staff, time, space, and money to simply warehousing records, and that is not what an archive is meant to be. Appraisal isn't just about old records, but rather thinking creatively about what current or yet to be created records will possess historical value and how to best plan for their preservation now. And we don't just think about paper records, but rather records in any format, including various types of digital formats. Early appraisal of electronic records and information systems is critical. The appraisal process represents an important partnership between the state archives and the agencies we support through our various services. Without the active cooperation, input, and assistance of state agencies, our appraisal activities will be less successful and the resulting historical record will be less reliable. Appraisal is also one of the key steps in how state agencies can leverage the expertise and resources of the state archives to lessen their records management burden. By working with the state archives to identify historical materials, agencies can proactively ensure the efficient management of such records and their timely transfer to our custody. This allows us to focus on the long-term preservation and access issues of historical materials, while agencies can focus on their other records management responsibilities while serving the people of New York. Please contact us if at any time you have questions about appraisal or would like assistance. Staff at the State Archives are here to support your records management efforts. And with that, I thank you for listening.